The biggest embezzlement problem that practices face is on the revenue side. In other words, theft of incoming patient payments or insurance payments. The expense side stealing certainly happens too, and it might be payroll tampering, it might be manipulation of a bonus, it might be doing something with how suppliers are paid that puts money in somebody's pockets. I mean, those things all happen too.
I am so excited for today's episode, but first we're going to jump into the Ask Ken segment. So today's question comes from a listener who says, my collections are growing, but I don't feel richer. Where is all the money going? Well, this is a very common thing, especially if you're in the growth pattern. Meaning if you're starting to grow, what happens is your accounts receivables start to get bigger. And if you're not on top of that, then your collections are going to be lower than they should be. Also, your accounts payable, often as you're growing, your accounts payable sometimes will also you'll be paying those too quickly and not utilizing the terms. And so what you really have here is it's just a pinch in working capital. And working capital is the money that's flowing into your process and into your system any given day, any given month. And so generally, whenever I get this question or when somebody asks me about this, I say, go and take a look at and make sure that your receivables are getting addressed as quickly as possible and that you're getting paid as quickly as possible. And then look at your terms with your vendors. Some of them may be giving you 30-day terms. So go ahead and wait until day 29 or day 30 to pay them. And what that does is that stretches out your working capital and makes you a very efficient operator of a dental group. All right. So super excited for our guest today. We have been on multiple podcasts together over the years. David Harris, I don't know that he needs that big of an introduction because he's been in and around the dental industry for well over 30 years. Super impressive. And he's definitely a staple in the industry and somebody that everybody should know. So David, why don't you go ahead, take a brief minute to tell people who you are and what you do, and then we're going to jump right into the dental truth that you want to expose to all of our listeners.
Definitely. Well, great to be with you, Ken, and we go back a long way, and always glad to have a chance to chat. As Ken said, my name is David Harris. I'm the CEO of the world's largest dental-specific forensic accounting firm. So we spend all day, every day, looking for leaks in the bucket of a solo dental practice or a group practice or a DSO. And Ken, to go back to the question that you were asked there, that I seem to be working hard, but I don't have anything to show for it. One other possibility is that there's somebody somewhere in the organization who's stealing, because that will produce that kind of phenomenon as well. And you were talking kind of about growth pains, and when an organization is growing, the expenses come more quickly than the revenue comes in. But what if the organization isn't growing and it has this problem? You asked about my truth. My truth is very simple. 70% of dental practice owners will be embezzled at some point.
Wow.
And
70%. Wow.
70. And that's a broad statistic covering everybody from solo practices to DSOs that have 800 practices. Now, as your configuration gets bigger, statistically, the chance that you will be embezzled this year goes up. So if you own 20 practices, there's probably an 80% chance that somebody will victimize you this year.
And part of that is because you're getting further and further away from where cash is being handled and those types of things are being handled, right?
There are a lot of factors as to why DSOs get stolen from. And one is, I think a lot of DSOs suffer from a little bit of overconfidence. In other words, we are big, therefore we must also be smart. And they certainly are in some ways, but thieves who tend to function, the embezzlers in dentistry tend to be at the practice level. I mean, we have certainly seen embezzlement in a head office department or something like that. But when you get right down to it, a DSO with 20 practices is basically like 20 small businesses that are kind of flying together in loose formation.
Yeah, and that's on their best day.
And that's on their best day. And as you're kind of suggesting, I think the further you go up the food chain, sometimes the less that the C-suite understands about kind of what goes on day to day in a practice. The second factor is rationalization. We all learned as kids that you don't steal other people's things. And every thief has to find a way to talk themselves out of that. In other words, I know that in general it's wrong to steal, but it's okay in this situation because, and then whatever they say after the because is the rationalization. It is much, much, much easier to rationalize stealing from a group of people you don't know or you don't know well than it is in, say, a solo practice where the doctor who signs your paychecks might work 20 feet away from you all day. That's an easier rationalization. The other factor is that DSOs tend to get into more complex arrangements than, let's say, a solo practice. You may have owner doctors who affiliated with you on an earnout. You have a lot of associate relationships. You have people working side by side doing similar jobs, but their compensation is asymmetrical. So you have a salaried dentist working next to a salaried hygienist working next to a dentist who's paid on percentage. And inevitably, if those two get together, they can find a way to stream the work through themselves that produces a financial advantage. So you have all these factors, and embezzlement's a real live issue for most DSOs.
Interesting. All right. So knowing and understanding then that 70%, which that number blows my mind, 70% will at some point face something like this. What is the antidote?
I don't think there's a one size fits all answer there. There are a few things that need to happen. And when you think about preventing embezzlement, and let's be clear that the biggest embezzlement problem that practices face is on the revenue side. In other words, it's theft of incoming patient payments or insurance payments. Expense side stealing certainly happens too, and it might be payroll tampering, it might be manipulation of a bonus, it might be doing something with how suppliers are paid that puts money in somebody's pockets. I mean, those things all happen too.
And it could also be instruments walking out the door, so to speak. Right.
I was about to mention, one of the classic steals that happens in a lot of dental offices is called the gold jar. And that's the jar in the operatory where the old restorations go. And, it tends to be kind of, it might hold at a moment in time $15,000 worth of gold. And it's controlled far less rigorously than the cash drawer that might have $800 in it. So yes, there's a problem there as well. But the biggest danger that practices face happens on the revenue side. And putting your accountant hat on for a minute, Ken, what differentiates dentistry from a lot of other businesses is that the accounting is really bifurcated. It's split between practice management software that tracks revenue and then some kind of accounting software that tracks expenses. And, hopefully those two converge at some point, but that isn't necessarily automatic.
Right.
So revenue theft is the big danger. How do you control it? Well, controlling revenue theft involves essentially two things. The first thing is to make sure that practice management software captured accurately what actually happened. And that's a challenge. When you have a sort of regional structure where you have maybe 8 practices reporting to a regional manager, having somebody oversee what happens in each practice to make sure that nothing untoward is happening is a challenge. The second part is making sure that what was recorded corresponds with what happened financially. And what I mean by that is if a practice collected $56,000 today, that we can track that $56,000 into the practice's bank account. And of course, the challenge with doing that is that the recording in practice management software and the depositing into the bank account may not happen at the same moment. So this is a challenge. And if a DSO is going to, or an individual practice for that matter, is going to defeat embezzlement, they have to do those two things. They have to make sure that software records accurately and that what happens in software, given that accurate reporting, follows through into the finances. So it means, for example, that regional managers have an embezzlement prevention role.
Right.
And the problem with that, and you've worked in DSOs, you know that. I mean, most regional managers don't have the background or the training or necessarily the outlook to really be able to police what goes on in practice management software. And then from there, somebody at head office has to make sure that the collections and deposits line up.
Right. Right. That reconciliation process needs to be completed.
It does.
So David, a question for you here then. So the end of day process that, let's say, the front office person or, those kinds of things, obviously like there's cash flowing through often at that point as well. Can you talk about the end of day process and how important, or maybe you'll tell me that, it's a totally flawed process, Ken, and it's not going to help anything. But could you walk me through the value of having an end of day process?
Absolutely.
And I'm seeing this for each practice. If you've got 20 locations, you've got 20 different, and where is all that documentation going to, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And let's step back and look at why a day end process exists in the first place. And I cut my teeth in this game before practices were computerized.
Mm.
And there used to be an old manual system called pegboard. And pegboard was created in the 1950s. And in those days, if you recall, well, you don't recall, but if you can imagine, most dentists were male and typically their offices were run by their wives. And the problem was that stealing wasn't the big issue. The problem was that some of these wives could add better than others. And this is also before there was such a thing as a pocket calculator. So, those math skills were kind of important. And day-end balancing involved looking at what the pegboard, the old manual system, said was collected and making sure that that was the same amount that went into the bank. And it was simple in those days because the number of forms of payment that a practice received were very small. I mean, typically it was cash or check. So it was really easy to look at what was going in the bank and compare it to what pegboard said patients and insurance companies paid and make sure that they lined up. That was kind of the genesis of the end of day report. You fast forward to 2025 and the basic concept hasn't changed. A practice should still be doing that. And this will catch certain types of embezzlement. It also just catches a whole lot of mistakes. Somebody puts a check in the deposit that didn't get posted to the patient's account.
Mhm.
That will show up as an out of balance situation.
Right.
Or somebody's fat fingers enters the wrong amount. And when totals are re-added for the bank deposit, they're different than the amounts put into practice management software. So aside from trying to stop people from stealing, it's a basic control. And it comes back to the kind of concept that you and I learned in accounting school of double entry accounting. So that day end has always been important, is still important. And it absolutely amazes me the number of practices that don't have a day end routine. When I started in this game, I mean, the given was that an office manager didn't leave the practice until today balanced.
And on their way home, they'd stop at the bank and drop any cash that had been received that day, right?
Well, that was the other part too, the daily bank deposit. But
Yes.
the balancing was a given. And I briefly ran an office, and back in the pegboard days, the amount that each patient owed was on what was called a ledger card. And these sat in a tub. And, sometimes these cards would get lost, like they'd get stuck in a chart or something. And if you couldn't find that card, you couldn't balance. And I remember, doing 7:30 p.m. kind of looks over my doctor's desks to see if, there was a ledger card that they had for some reason taken out of the tray and not put back. So that was the activity back then. What's made balancing challenging is the wide variety now of the way that practices get paid. So in addition to the cash and check that were the way people got paid in 1989 when I was dealing with this problem, you have credit card payments and virtual credit card payments from insurance companies, and you have electronic funds transfers. There are a lot of different ways that money moves into the practice, and they're not synchronized in the same way they were in 1989. In other words, the cash and checks you held in your hand and you could take to the bank. Now you have patients paying by credit card, and there's a couple of settlement days typically before the money hits the account. And that all makes it a little more challenging, but it still must happen.
Fascinating. Really, the digitization of how money moves has created more potential liability for dental practices. I'd never put that together, but did I say that correctly?
The way I would encapsulate it is that moving to practice management software created more opportunities for thieves.
Got it. Okay.
And, from the perspective of practice owners, and I'm thinking of an individual practice now, but I think my comment would equally apply to a bigger entity. Back in the days when pegboard was used, you could have a dentist who wasn't terribly well versed in business, who could understand pegboard fairly well. And you also had clues. I mean, you could see whose handwriting made an entry, for example. But you would typically know the penmanship of everybody on your team, and you could just tell from the handwriting who did it. I remember back in the day, we used to give hygienists green pens. So when charting was done, the hygienist would chart in green and the doctor would chart in blue or black. And then you could look at a chart and you can just easily differentiate one from the other.
Interesting.
But when a practice owner was looking at pegboard, they were looking at actual transactions. They saw every individual entry. Now what's provided to practice owners is reports. And a report is an abstraction of transactions. In other words, it's an aggregation as opposed to seeing the raw data. And that changes things. And because a lot of practice owners aren't terribly well versed in their practice management software, they're dependent on somebody to produce a report and give it to them. which also opens the door fairly widely to selective reporting.
Right. Right.
And selective reporting is when you're looking at something and you think it tells the whole story, and in fact, it doesn't. And that is so easy to do in practice management software. And I'm not going to start giving somebody who wants to take advantage of this ideas as to how to do it. But one thing I'll say to the solo practice owners listening in on this conversation is print your own damn reports. And if you're a DSO and you have a reconciliation department, do not let the individual practices generate reports and upload them to a shared drive somewhere and then have them reviewed by the reconciliation department. The reconciliation department needs the ability to put its own hands on the software and get its own reports and reconcile from those.
Great. That's great advice. So, David, as we're starting to break into some of these things and probably heading down toward the end of the episode, I'm sitting here wondering what would be the top 3 practices or things that should be done or things that have to be considered to do the best you can to try to stave off fraud, in general. And particularly, we're talking about theft here, right? But yeah. I'm curious to know kind of, you've been doing this for so long, you've seen every trick in the book. And of course we know that people are smart and they're always looking for workarounds and things, if, to the degree they can, as you said earlier, justify, behavior. But yeah, what would maybe be the top 3 things that you would want to tell all the listeners that, hey, if you're doing these 3 things, you're at least on the right track to try to deter and to try to avoid this problem?
Well, let's start with doing a proper job of pre-employment screening.
Okay.
One thing that we see a lot of is what we call serial embezzlers.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not talking about people who steal your breakfast food here. I'm talking about people who work in one practice and they get caught and they get fired. And then 3 or 4 weeks later, they're working across the street and, of course, doing the same thing. And DSOs are always hungry for experienced people. And the serial embezzlers know that, and they get a little bit artistic about how they hide their baggage. And the DSOs don't necessarily burn through it and do a proper screening job.
Okay.
One statistic that everyone in your audience needs to hear, Ken, is that 70 million Americans, which equates to 1 in 4 adults in the United States, has a criminal record. Now, not every one of those criminal records would stop me from hiring somebody. If somebody had been busted for possession of marijuana 20 years ago in college and they've been clean ever since, I would look past that one pretty quickly.
Sure.
On the other hand, somebody who had a conviction for check fraud 2 years ago is a complete no-go in my practice.
Right.
So pre-employment screening, criminal record check is part of it, but it doesn't stop there. Drug testing. It absolutely amazes me that the majority of practices do not drug test applicants. The important one, of course, is speaking with former employers, bearing in mind that if a thief has baggage and they're trying to hide it, they may contrive to prevent you from speaking with former employers, and you have to work through that.
Right. Right.
Those are the pre-employment screening is a big component because there are probably 100,000 people out there in the U.S. who have stolen from a dental practice and would love to do it again. So let's not give them the opportunity.
Got it.
The second thing is we need solid financial controls at the practice level. So this involves division of duties. It involves that day-end routine that you and I were talking about a few minutes ago. It involves who has admin rights in practice management software.
Mm-hmm.
You need those controls and you need the enforcer because, let's be honest, most stealing that happens in dental practices is done by the office manager, and that's the person who is put there to be the guard. And when the guard steals, if they have no oversight, they get away with it. So that's always a challenge. The third thing is, as I say, regional managers are often the best equipped people to realize there's a problem, but they tend not to have the training or the scope in their duties to really monitor the offices that they supervise for stealing. And then the fourth thing is you need that piece that happens at head office where there's reconciliation done and it's done effectively.
Right. All right. So instead of 3, we went to 4. All
I
of
did.
these.
I gave you a bonus.
Yeah. Bonus content. Perfect. Yeah. All these are fairly simple. One thing when I was at, the CFO to large DSO, one of the other things that we actually used the regional managers for was to do till cash audits. And we would just have randomly select whatever practice they were going to that day to, go check in or whatever. And we'd have them just open up the box and see what's going on and see if it, matched the prior day records and everything else. That was fairly effective. And I'll tell you this, David, we never had a regional manager actually find something wrong, but all the people in the practice and then the others that they were connected to in other practices, they all knew that at any point in time that box could get opened up by a regional manager. And so just having that, something like that, we found that to be not perfect. It didn't deter any and all efforts to potentially engage in theft, but it was something that was definitely talked about, and people knew that, hey, they're checking in on us and they're making sure that the cash is in there that needs to be in there, and other assets that are in there need to be in there. So I don't know if you have a thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, it sends a message. The limitation of that approach is that the majority of theft does not involve cash.
Yeah, fair.
There was a time 30 or 40 years ago when what embezzlers stole in dental practices was predominantly cash. That's not the case anymore.
Got it.
And most of the money that we see stolen is diversion of something else. So that's kind of the limitation of the cash for audit. But I agree with you. It sets a culture. It sends a message. Sorry, I totally lost the rest of that question.
That's okay. As we're getting to kind of a wrap up on this, what would be kind of some of your parting words here, David, that you would advise all of these, dentist practice owners and DSOs? What would parting words would you want to leave with them in terms of how they should be thinking about this problem?
Well, one thing, and you mentioned the cash audit a minute ago, and I said there's a limitation to that, which is that cash is not the thief's only choice. One thing I'll mention, and this is a service that we offer, is that we perform broader audits on a practice. And this can be done stealthily, so the staff don't even have to know that it's happening at the time. I mean, you can, of course, tell them later if you choose to. But we do a much more comprehensive, thorough audit, and we will look at it, whether adjustments are being used appropriately and whether checks are going into the right place and whether somebody's stealing credit card payments and so on. So it's a much more thorough event. And a fair number of DSOs use us in that way to find out what they don't know. Those audits are really the way you learn things about your organization that you would have almost no other way of learning.
Awesome.
So
how often would you recommend, I'm going to talk from the perspective now of just a solo practice, or, maybe 2 locations, something like that. How often would you recommend that they would do this type of an audit? Is this sort of a one-time thing or every few years? How do you think about that?
I'm not generally a big fan of doing it on a schedule.
Sure.
I'd rather teach a practice owner how to put some basic controls in place and to have some appreciation for what it would look like in their practice if theft was going on. In other words, I want to give the practice owner the diagnostic tools. And then when they use those tools and they say, okay, something's not right here, then they call us for an audit. Doing it on a schedule on a solo practice is probably not something we encourage.
Got it.
With DSOs, if we had and we have several DSOs who have a target percentage. So we have one that wants us to audit 5% of their practices every year. And we kind of collaborate with them in selecting which 5% get targeted, and some of them are purely random. Some of them are statistical outliers. For example, if there's a practice that's having abnormally high turnover, that's almost always a really good audit target.
Okay.
Outliers in terms of revenue per patient or gross versus adjusted production, yardsticks like that sometimes will tell you that a practice is different from the other 18 that you own, and let's find out why. So we tend to provide some insight as to why a certain practice might be a really juicy audit target.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think we're right at the point where it's time to wrap up. Any final thoughts before we close up this episode?
Absolutely. What one of my clients said to me was, when you reach the point where you're convinced that your controls are good and you can't be stolen from, that's about when it's going to happen. And a second client who got taken for a fair amount of money, when I asked him afterwards, well, what did you learn from this whole episode? He said, I learned to trust systems, not people. So I'll leave those 2 quotes from my clients with you for whatever the audience can take them from.
All right. That's perfect. Well, that's it for today's episode of Dental Truth Project. Thanks again to David Harris, our guest, for joining us and sharing all of these amazing insights. In fact, David, why don't you really quickly just share how people can connect with you if they'd like to?
Absolutely. The best place to go is our website, which is www.prosperident.com. And anybody can find us there, or they can call our toll-free number, which is 888-398-2327. Oh, 888-398-2327.
Perfect. All right. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. We have a new episode that drops every Wednesday morning. I'm Ken Kaufman, and until next time, keep seeking the truth that helps dentistry thrive. Happy day.